April 18th, 1942. Tokyo, Japan. It's midday in the heart of the Japanese Empire. Citizens go about their daily routines, confident in their safety. Why wouldn't they be? Their military has conquered vast territories across the Pacific and Asia. Their naval forces have decimated the American fleet at Pearl Harbor just 4 months earlier. Their home islands are protected by thousands of miles of ocean, supposedly putting them beyond the reach of American retaliation. Then, the impossible happens. Air raid sirens begin to wail across Tokyo. People look up to see American bombers, B-25 Mitchell bombers, roaring at low altitude over their capital city. Bombs begin to fall. Explosions rock military installations, factories, and dockyards. The untouchable Japanese homeland is under attack. But here's what makes this moment absolutely incredible. These American bombers have no way to return home. Their crews know they're on a one-way mission. They've launched from an aircraft carrier 650 miles away, something military experts said was impossible. And the man who planned this audacious raid? A daredevil pilot named Jimmy Doolittle, who convinced the American military to attempt the most desperate gamble of the entire war. This is the story of the Doolittle Raid. A mission so bold, so unexpected, and so psychologically devastating that it shocked the Japanese Empire into a fatal realization. The Americans were only beginning to fight. And that realization would lead Japan to make the single biggest strategic mistake of the Pacific War. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of the most incredible true stories in military history. Before we dive into the raid itself, we need to understand the context. Because without that context, you can't fully appreciate just how desperate and audacious this mission truly was. Let's go back to December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet was devastatingly effective. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack shocked the American public and brought the United States into World War II. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, the Japanese military seemed unstoppable. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands. Hong Kong fell, Wake Island fell, Guam fell. The British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk. American and Allied forces were in full retreat across the Pacific. By early 1942, Japan had achieved all of its initial strategic objectives and more. They had secured access to vital oil, rubber, and other resources from Southeast Asia. They had established a defensive perimeter of island bases protecting their home islands, and they had done all of this in just a few months with relatively light losses. American morale was at rock bottom. Every day brought news of new defeats, new surrenders, new disasters. The American public was asking questions. Could we even fight back? Were the Japanese truly invincible? How long would it take before we could even begin to strike back at the enemy? President Franklin Roosevelt was feeling the pressure. He needed to show the American people and the world that the United States could hit back. He needed a victory, any victory, no matter how symbolic. In January 1942, Roosevelt asked his military chiefs a simple question. How soon can we strike back at Japan? How soon can we bomb Tokyo? The answer from his military advisors was sobering. It would take years to build up the forces necessary to strike at the Japanese home islands. The Navy's carrier fleet was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Army Air Forces didn't have bombers that could reach Japan from any existing bases.
The closest American-held territories were thousands of miles away. It seemed impossible, but one man thought he saw a way. Captain Francis Lowe was a submariner serving on the staff of Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations. In January 1942, Lowe was at Naval Air Station Norfolk when he saw something that sparked an idea. Army bombers were practicing takeoffs painted on an airfield to simulate an aircraft carrier deck. Lowe thought, what if we actually did that? What if we loaded Army bombers onto a Navy aircraft carrier, sailed close to Japan, and launched them to bomb Tokyo? It was an absurd idea on its face. Army bombers had never taken off from carriers. They were too big, too heavy, and required too much runway. Even if they could take off, they couldn't land back on the carrier. The bombers were far too large for carrier landings. It would be a one-way mission. But Lowe took the idea to his boss, Admiral Ernest King, who surprisingly didn't dismiss it out of hand. King took it to General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. Arnold was intrigued. If they could pull it off, it would be exactly the kind of bold action that Roosevelt was demanding. The question was, could it be done? And if so, who would be crazy enough to lead it? The answer to both questions was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, though everyone called him Jimmy. Jimmy Doolittle was already a legend in American aviation. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had won virtually every air race in America during the 1920s and 30s. He had performed the first outside loop, the first instrument-only flight, and had set numerous speed records. He was a pilot's pilot, a brilliant engineer, and a natural leader. But he was also 45 years old in 1942, considered by many to be too old for combat missions. Doolittle had been working on aviation fuel development when he heard about the plan to bomb Tokyo. He immediately volunteered to plan and lead the mission. Arnold accepted. He knew that if anyone could make this impossible mission work, it was Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle threw himself into the planning with characteristic intensity. He needed to select the right aircraft, recruit volunteer crews, figure out the training requirements, plan the routes, and solve a dozen seemingly impossible problems. First question, which aircraft? It had to be a twin-engine bomber capable of carrying a decent bomb load. It had to have enough range to reach Japan from a carrier and then fly onward to friendly territory in China. And critically, it had to be able to take off in the short distance available on a carrier deck. Doolittle selected the B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was relatively new, had good range, could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, and with modifications, might be able to take off from a carrier deck. The might was important. No B-25 had ever attempted a carrier takeoff before. Next question, could it actually be done? In early February 1942, two B-25s were loaded on the USS Hornet at Naval Air Station Norfolk. The Navy pilots were skeptical. The Army pilots were nervous. But when the moment came, both B-25s successfully took off from the carrier deck with room to spare. It could be done. Now came the harder parts, recruiting crews, modifying the aircraft, planning the routes, and training for a mission that had never been attempted before. Doolittle needed 24 crews, 5 men each, to fly 24 modified B-25 bombers. The mission was so dangerous and unprecedented that Doolittle insisted all participants be volunteers. He gathered crews at Eglin Field in Florida and told them only that they would be training for a mission that was extremely hazardous, important, and interesting. He couldn't tell them the target or even confirm it involved combat. Every single crew volunteered anyway. The training was intense and unusual. The B-25 crews had to learn short field takeoffs, much shorter than normal. They practiced taking off in distances of 500 feet or less, when the B-25 normally required 1,000 feet. They practiced low-altitude flying, navigation over water, and night flying. They trained for weeks without knowing their actual destination. Meanwhile, Doolittle supervised extensive modifications to the B-25s. The aircraft needed to be as light as possible to maximize takeoff performance and range. The lower gun turret was removed and replaced with a fake gun made of broomstick painted black. It would fool Japanese fighters from a distance, but saved significant weight. Additional fuel tanks were installed in every available space, increasing fuel capacity from 646 gallons to over 1,100 gallons. The Norden bomb sight, top-secret equipment, was removed and replaced with a simple makeshift sight that cost only 20 cents to make. Every aircraft was stripped of all unnecessary equipment. Even the liaison radio was removed to save weight. This meant the bombers would have no way to communicate with the carrier once they launched. The crews would be on their own. The bomb load was carefully selected, 4 500-pound bombs per aircraft. 3 would be high-explosive demolition bombs, and 1 would be an incendiary cluster. The incendiaries were particularly important because so much of Japanese construction was wood and paper. Fires would spread rapidly. But here was the biggest problem. Even with all these modifications, the B-25s couldn't carry enough fuel to return to the carrier or reach any American-held territory after bombing Japan. The plan was to bomb Japan, then fly westward to China, where Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces were allied with the Americans. The bombers would land at Chinese airfields or, if necessary, the crews would bail out and make their way to friendly forces. This meant coordinating with the Chinese, who would need to prepare airfields and arrange rescue operations. It also meant the entire mission depended on factors beyond American control: Chinese cooperation, weather, fuel consumption, and a huge amount of luck. As training continued, Doolittle finally revealed the target to his crews: Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The reaction was mixed: excitement at striking back at the enemy, but also sobering realization of the danger involved. Security was paramount. The crews were told to tell no one, not family, not friends, not other military personnel. The mission was so secret that even most high-ranking officers didn't know about it. It was given the code name Special Aviation Project No. 1, and later simply called First Special Aviation Project. In late March 1942, 16 B-25s were selected for the actual mission, 8 fewer than originally planned, to leave more room on the carrier deck. These 16 aircraft were carefully loaded onto the USS Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. The sight was extraordinary. 16 Army bombers crowded onto a Navy carrier deck, their wingtips overhanging the edges. The crews boarded the Hornet, still uncertain of when they would launch. On April 2, 1942, the Hornet departed San Francisco Bay and headed west into the Pacific Ocean. Accompanying the carrier was a task force including the cruisers Vincennes and Nashville, the oiler Cimarron, and 4 destroyers. On April 13th, the Hornet Task Force rendezvoused with another carrier task force led by the USS Enterprise, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey. The combined force, Task Force 16, now included 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers. This was a significant portion of America's remaining Pacific Fleet, all committed to this one desperate mission. Doolittle briefed all personnel on the Hornet about the mission. The plan was to sail to within 400 miles of Japan, launch the bombers on the evening of April 18th, bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities at night, and then fly to China under cover of darkness. The crews made their final preparations. They painted their aircraft. They wrote letters home, not knowing if they'd survive. Some played cards, some prayed, some tried to sleep. Doolittle himself seemed calm and confident, though he later admitted he gave the mission only a 50-50 chance of success. Task Force 16 sailed westward through rough seas, maintaining radio silence and hoping to avoid detection by Japanese patrol boats and submarines. Every mile closer to Japan increased the danger, but also increased the bomber's chances of reaching China safely. Then, on the morning of April 18th, everything went wrong.
April 18th, 1942, dawned gray and stormy. Task Force 16 was approximately 650 miles east of Japan, still 250 miles farther than planned. The seas were rough, with waves reaching 30 feet. The Hornet's deck pitched and rolled violently. At 7:38 a.m., the Enterprise's radar picked up two vessels approximately 12,000 yards ahead. Minutes later, lookouts spotted a Japanese patrol boat, the Nito Maru. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible decision. The patrol boat had almost certainly radioed a warning to Japan. The element of surprise was lost. Japanese forces would now be on high alert, and Japanese fighters and ships would be searching for the American task force. Halsey had three options: abort the mission entirely, continue westward and hope to launch closer to Japan, or launch immediately from the current position, 650 miles out instead of the planned 400. Launching from 650 miles meant the bombers had almost no chance of reaching the planned airfields in China. The crews would likely have to bail out over China or ditch in the ocean. But aborting meant wasting this opportunity and possibly never getting another chance to strike at Japan. Halsey made his decision. He signaled to the Hornet, "Launch aircraft." To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you. On the Hornet, alarm bells rang. Doolittle gathered his crews and gave them the news. They were launching now, immediately, in rough seas, from 650 miles out. The mission had just become even more desperate and dangerous. But again, every crew volunteered to proceed. The deck crews moved into action, positioning Doolittle's aircraft, aircraft number 1, at the rear of the deck for the first launch. The other 15 bombers were lined up behind him, their wingtips overhanging the edges of the carrier deck, leaving a narrow 40-foot wide takeoff lane. The conditions were terrible. The Hornet was pitching and rolling in heavy seas. Rain squalls swept across the deck. The wind was strong but variable. Navy deck crews had tied down the bombers with chains, but they would have to be released at exactly the right moment. Doolittle climbed into his bomber. His crew consisted of co-pilot Lieutenant Richard Cole, navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter, bombardier Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, and engineer gunner Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard. These 5 men would be the first to attempt what no one had done before: take off in a fully loaded B-25 bomber from a carrier deck in rough seas. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, the Hornet's flight deck officer, would signal when to launch. He watched the pitching deck carefully, waiting for the precise moment when the bow rose on a wave. This would give the aircraft an extra upward boost at the critical moment of takeoff. Doolittle revved his engines to full power. The B-25 strained against the wheel chocks. Miller watched the bow, timing the waves. The carrier rose on a swell. Miller dropped his flag, the signal to launch. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 lurched forward, gathering speed down the narrow deck. The aircraft bounced over the deck seams. It accelerated toward the bow, wind howling, spray flying. The crew held their breath. The bomber reached the end of the deck and dropped toward the ocean. Then the nose came up. Doolittle's aircraft climbed away from the carrier, struggling for altitude with its heavy load of fuel and bombs. It worked.
One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. Each takeoff was a heart-stopping moment. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft, number 2, nearly crashed into the ocean before clawing its way into the air. Lieutenant Brick Holmstrom's bomber, number 3, had an engine nearly quit on takeoff. Every launch was a minor miracle. The final bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Farrow, had the most difficult takeoff position because there was the least deck space available. But Farrow's bomber, like the others, successfully launched and climbed away. All 16 bombers were airborne by 9:20 a.m. Not a single aircraft was lost during launch, a remarkable achievement given the conditions and the unprecedented nature of the operation. Task Force 16 immediately turned east and headed for safety at maximum speed. The ships had accomplished their mission. Now it was up to Doolittle and his crews. The 16 bombers formed up loosely and headed west toward Japan, flying low to avoid radar detection. They were on their own now, with no communication with the task force and no way to get help if something went wrong. They had enough fuel to reach Japan and bomb their targets, but whether they could make it to China was an open question. Inside each bomber, crews checked their systems, confirmed their navigation, and prepared mentally for what was coming. They knew they were flying into the heart of the Japanese Empire with no support, no backup, and no realistic way home. Some crews were excited, some were terrified, some were grimly determined. All of them kept flying west. As they approached the Japanese coast, the weather began to improve. The clouds broke up, visibility increased. Around 1:30 p.m., the crews spotted land ahead. Japan. There was no turning back now. April 18, 1942 dawned gray and stormy. Task Force 16 was approximately 650 miles east of Japan, still 250 miles farther than planned. The seas were rough, with waves reaching 30 feet. The Hornet's deck pitched and rolled violently. At 7:38 a.m., the Enterprise's radar picked up 2 vessels approximately 12,000 yards ahead. Minutes later, lookouts spotted a Japanese patrol boat, the Nito Maru. Admiral Halsey faced an impossible decision. The patrol boat had almost certainly radioed a warning to Japan. The element of surprise was lost. Japanese forces would now be on high alert, and Japanese fighters and ships would be searching for the American task force. Halsey had 3 options: abort the mission entirely, continue westward and hope to launch closer to Japan, or launch immediately from the current position, 650 miles out, instead of the planned 400. Launching from 650 miles meant the bombers had almost no chance of reaching the planned airfields in China. The crews would likely have to bail out over China or ditch in the ocean. But aborting meant wasting this opportunity and possibly never getting another chance to strike at Japan. Halsey made his decision. He signaled to the Hornet, "Launch aircraft." To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you. On the Hornet, alarm bells rang. Doolittle gathered his crews and gave them the news. They were launching now, immediately, in rough seas from 650 miles out. The mission had just become even more desperate and dangerous. But again, every crew volunteered to proceed. The deck crews moved into action, positioning Doolittle's aircraft number 1 at the rear of the deck for the first launch. The other 15 bombers were lined up behind him, their wingtips overhanging the edges of the carrier deck, leaving a narrow 40-foot-wide takeoff lane. The conditions were terrible. The Hornet was pitching and rolling in heavy seas. Rain squalls swept across the deck. The wind was strong but variable. Navy deck crews had tied down the bombers with chains, but they would have to be released at exactly the right moment. Doolittle climbed into his bomber. His crew consisted of Lieutenant Richard Cole, Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter, Bombardier Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer, and Engineer-Gunner Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard. These 5 men would be the first to attempt what no one had done before: take off in a fully loaded B-25 bomber from a carrier deck in rough seas. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller, the Hornet's flight deck officer, would signal when to launch. He watched the pitching deck carefully, waiting for the precise moment when the bow rose on a wave. This would give the aircraft an extra upward boost at the critical moment of takeoff. Doolittle revved his engines to full power. The B-25 strained against the wheel chocks. Miller watched the bow, timing the waves. The carrier rose on a swell. Miller dropped his flag, the signal to launch. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 lurched forward, gathering speed down the narrow deck. The aircraft bounced over the deck seams. It accelerated toward the bow, wind howling, spray flying. The crew held their breath. The bomber reached the end of the deck and dropped toward the ocean. Then the nose came up. Doolittle's aircraft climbed away from the carrier, struggling for altitude with its heavy load of fuel and bombs. It worked. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. Each takeoff was a heart-stopping moment. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's aircraft, number 2, nearly crashed into the ocean before clawing its way into the air. Lieutenant Brick Holmstrom's bomber, number 3, had an engine nearly quit on takeoff. Every launch was a minor miracle. The final bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Bill Farrow, had the most difficult takeoff position because there was the least deck space available. But Farrow's bomber, like the others, successfully launched and climbed away. All 16 bombers were airborne by 9:20 a.m. Not a single aircraft was lost during launch, a remarkable achievement given the conditions and the unprecedented nature of the operation. Task Force 16 immediately turned east and headed for safety at maximum speed. The ships had accomplished their mission. Now it was up to Doolittle and his crews. All 16 bombers formed up loosely and headed west toward Japan, flying low to avoid radar detection. They were on their own now, with no communication with the task force and no way to get help if something went wrong. They had enough fuel to reach Japan and bomb their targets, but whether they could make it to China was an open question. Inside each bomber, crews checked their systems, confirmed their navigation, and prepared mentally for what was coming. They knew they were flying into the heart of the Japanese Empire with no support, no backup, and no realistic way home. Some crews were excited, some were terrified, some were grimly determined. All of them kept flying west. As they approached the Japanese coast, the weather began to improve. The clouds broke up, visibility increased. Around 12:30 p.m., the crews spotted land ahead, Japan. There was no turning back now. As the 15 bombers fled westward across the East China Sea toward the Chinese coast, crews began calculating fuel consumption and realized they were in serious trouble. Launching 250 miles farther from Japan than planned meant they were burning through fuel faster than expected. Doolittle's aircraft crossed the Chinese coast around dusk. Visibility was deteriorating rapidly. Rain squalls reduced visibility to near zero. The crews had been told that Chinese airfields would be ready for them, with lights to guide them in for landing. But when they reached the expected locations of Chinese airfields, they saw only darkness. No lights, no radio beacons, nothing. What the Americans didn't know was that the Chinese had received the message about the incoming bombers, but had misunderstood the timing. They weren't expecting the aircraft until the following day. The airfields were dark and unprepared. The bombers circled in the darkness, burning precious fuel, searching desperately for a place to land. One by one, fuel gauges dropped toward empty. The crews faced an impossible situation. It was night, visibility was terrible, they were over mountainous terrain, and they had no idea where safe landing areas might be. Doolittle made the decision first. His crew would bail out. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Doolittle ordered his crew to put on their parachutes. They were flying at about 8,000 feet over mountainous terrain in total darkness and rain. One by one, Doolittle's crew jumped from the aircraft. Doolittle went last, after setting the autopilot to keep the bomber flying away from populated areas until it ran out of fuel and crashed. He jumped into the darkness, his parachute opened, and he descended through the rain, having no idea what was below him. Doolittle landed in a rice paddy, or rather in what he later described as something soft and smelly. It was a dung heap used to fertilize the fields. Wet, cold, and covered in excrement, the 45-year-old aviation legend spent the night huddled in a small Chinese building, convinced the mission had been a complete failure and that he would be court-martialed when he returned home. The other bomber crews faced similar situations. Lieutenant Lawson's ruptured duck ran out of fuel over the ocean just off the Chinese coast. Lawson attempted a water landing in the dark. The aircraft hit the waves hard, breaking apart on impact. Lawson was badly injured, his left leg nearly severed. Bombardier Lieutenant Robert Cleaver died in the crash. The surviving crew members struggled ashore, wounded and exhausted. Lieutenant Hallmark's bomber also crashed into the ocean. 2 crew members drowned. The survivors, Hallmark, his co-pilot Lieutenant Robert Metter, and navigator Sergeant William Dieter, made it to shore, but were quickly captured by Japanese forces who occupied that part of China. Lieutenant Farrow's bomber also ran out of fuel and bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory. All 5 crew members survived the bailout, but were captured within hours by Japanese troops. The other 12 bomber crews bailed out or crash-landed in various locations across eastern China. Some crews stayed together, others were separated during the bailouts. Some parachuted into mountains, others into fields. One crew member landed in a tree and hung suspended until Chinese farmers found him the next morning. Lieutenant Travis Hoover's entire crew survived their bailouts and were found by friendly Chinese civilians and soldiers. Lieutenant Brick Holmstrom's crew also made it down safely and were assisted by Chinese guerrillas. Lieutenant Bob Gray's crew survived, but were scattered across miles of countryside. The Chinese reaction to these strange foreign airmen falling from the sky varied. Some areas were controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, who were allied with America. Other areas were controlled by Chinese communists, who were also fighting the Japanese, but weren't officially allied with America. And some areas were controlled or heavily patrolled by Japanese occupation forces. Chinese civilians who found the American airmen generally tried to help them, despite the enormous personal risk. The Japanese were known to execute entire villages if they discovered the villagers had assisted American airmen. But many Chinese civilians and soldiers helped anyway, moving the Americans from village to village, hiding them from Japanese patrols, providing food and medical care, and slowly guiding them towards safety. Doolittle, after his undignified landing in the dung heap, was found by Chinese soldiers the next morning. He was reunited with his crew over the following days. As they traveled westward toward safety, Doolittle heard reports that other crews had also survived, but that some were missing or captured. Lieutenant Lawson, badly injured from his crash, was carried on a stretcher by Chinese volunteers for miles through mountainous terrain to reach medical help. His injured leg eventually had to be amputated, but he survived thanks to the courage of Chinese civilians who risked everything to help him. Over the following weeks, most of the Doolittle raiders made their way to safety. They traveled by foot, by horse, by sedan chair, by riverboat, and eventually by aircraft, moving westward through China toward Chongqing, the wartime capital of nationalist China. 11 complete crews, 55 men, eventually made it to safety. Lieutenant York's crew of 5 was interned in the Soviet Union. 3 men had died in crashes: Corporal Leland Factor from Lieutenant Hallmark's crew and Sergeant William Dieter drowned, and Lieutenant Robert Cleaver from Lieutenant Lawson's crew died in the crash. 8 men had been captured by the Japanese: Lieutenant Hallmark, Lieutenant Metter, Corporal Jacob de Shazer, Sergeant Harold Spatz, Lieutenant William Farrow, Lieutenant Robert Height, Sergeant George Barr, and Corporal Chase Nielsen. What happened to those 8 captured men would shock the world and demonstrate the true brutality of the Japanese military government. The 8 captured Doolittle Raiders were transported to Tokyo, where they were imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured. The Japanese military was furious about the raid and determined to make examples of the captured Americans. The prisoners were held in solitary confinement, interrogated repeatedly, beaten, starved, and subjected to psychological torture. The Japanese interrogators demanded to know how the Americans had reached Japan. They still couldn't believe bombers had launched from carriers. After months of brutal treatment, the Japanese government announced that the 8 captured airmen would be tried as war criminals. The charge was that they had deliberately bombed civilian areas, which the Japanese claimed violated international law. This was propaganda. The targets had been military and industrial facilities. And even if some bombs had struck civilian areas, this was standard practice in wartime and not a war crime. The trial was a sham. The prisoners had no legal representation, couldn't speak Japanese, and weren't allowed to present any defense. The verdict was predetermined. All 8 were sentenced to death. However, international pressure, particularly from Switzerland, which was representing American interests in Japan, caused the Japanese government to hesitate. Emperor Hirohito himself reviewed the sentences. In what the Japanese presented as an act of clemency, 5 of the death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. 3 sentences were carried out. On October 15, 1942, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were executed by firing squad. They were 25, 24, and 20 years old, respectively. Before their execution, they were allowed to write final letters to their families. Those letters would not reach America until after the war ended. The 5 surviving prisoners, Lieutenant Meter, Lieutenant Height, Corporal Jacob de Shazer, Sergeant George Barr, and Corporal Chase Nielsen, remained in Japanese captivity under horrific conditions. They were held in solitary confinement, given minimal food, denied medical care, and subjected to continued abuse. Lieutenant Robert Meter, weakened by starvation and disease, died in captivity on December 1, 1933. He was 27 years old. The 4 remaining prisoners, Height, de Shazer, Barr, and Nielsen, somehow survived 3 years of imprisonment. They endured starvation, disease, psychological torture, and the constant threat of execution. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, all 4 were severely malnourished and ill, but alive. When Allied forces liberated Japanese prison camps after the surrender, they found the 4 surviving Doolittle Raiders and brought them home. Their stories of survival and the execution of their fellow crew members shocked the American public and became powerful examples of Japanese war crimes. Meanwhile, the Japanese military response to the Doolittle Raid extended beyond punishing the captured airmen. The Japanese army launched a massive operation in eastern China called the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign, intended to punish Chinese civilians and soldiers who had helped the American airmen, and to destroy airfields that might be used for future raids. Japanese forces swept through the Chinese provinces where the raiders had landed. They destroyed entire villages, executed thousands of Chinese civilians, burned airfields, and deployed biological weapons in some areas. Estimates of Chinese casualties from this retaliatory campaign range from 250,000 to possibly more than 1 million deaths. The Chinese people had helped American airmen at enormous cost to themselves, a sacrifice that Americans of the time recognized, but that has often been forgotten in popular memory of the raid.
Now we come to the most important part of the story. What did the Doolittle Raid actually accomplish? Because here's the thing, the physical damage was minimal. A few dozen buildings destroyed, some factories damaged, fewer than 100 Japanese killed. In material terms, it was barely a pinprick. But in psychological and strategic terms, the Doolittle Raid was one of the most consequential operations of the entire Pacific War. First, the impact on American morale was enormous. Remember, this was April 1942. Americans had been receiving nothing but bad news for months. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, surrender after surrender, defeat after defeat. The country was in a dark place psychologically. Then came news of the Doolittle Raid. American bombers had struck Tokyo. We had hit back at the enemy. We had shown that we could reach them. The psychological boost to American morale was immeasurable. Newspapers ran banner headlines. Roosevelt praised the mission. The American public finally had something to celebrate. Doolittle, who had been convinced he would be court-martialed for losing all his aircraft, was instead awarded the Medal of Honor and promoted 2 grades, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. His crews were all decorated. They became heroes, symbols of American determination and ingenuity. But the real impact was on the Japanese side, and this is where the story gets really interesting. The Japanese military and government were shocked by the raid in ways that are hard to overstate. Their entire strategic planning had been based on the assumption that the home islands were safe from attack. They had calculated that American bombers couldn't reach Japan, and therefore they didn't need to maintain strong defensive forces at home. The Doolittle Raid shattered that assumption. If American bombers could reach Tokyo once, they could do it again. Maybe next time with more bombers. Maybe next time with a coordinated attack. The emperor himself was in Tokyo during the raid. What if the next attack killed him? Japanese military planners immediately began arguing for changes in strategy. They needed to push the defensive perimeter farther from the home islands. They needed to secure bases that would prevent American carriers from getting close enough to launch attacks. They needed to destroy the American carrier fleet before it could threaten Japan again. This thinking led directly to one of the most important battles in naval history, the Battle of Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese combined fleet, had already been considering an operation to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle. The Doolittle Raid gave him the argument he needed to convince the Japanese High Command to approve the plan. Yamamoto proposed attacking Midway Island, a strategic American base about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The attack on Midway would force the Americans to respond with their carriers, and the Japanese fleet would be waiting to destroy them. With the American carriers eliminated, the threat of raids on Japan would be eliminated. The plan was approved. In early June 1942, less than 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, the Japanese launched Operation MI, the attack on Midway. But here's what the Japanese didn't know.
American code breakers had cracked Japanese naval codes. The Americans knew the attack was coming. They knew where and approximately when. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers, including the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, the same carrier that launched the Doolittle Raid, in ambush positions northeast of Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4th to 7th, 1942, was a catastrophic defeat for Japan. In one day, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and crew. The United States lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan never recovered from the loss of those 4 carriers and their air groups. From that moment on, Japan was on the strategic defensive, gradually losing ground to the American advance across the Pacific. And it happened because the Doolittle Raid had shocked the Japanese into attempting to extend their defensive perimeter and destroy the American carriers before they could strike again. The raid didn't just boost American morale, it directly contributed to the Japanese making a strategic mistake that cost them the war. Think about that for a moment. 16 bombers, dropping bombs that did minimal physical damage, set in motion a chain of events that led to Japan's greatest naval defeat and the eventual loss of the war. That's the power of psychological warfare and strategic initiative.
After the raid, the surviving Doolittle Raiders were sent home for a hero's welcome. They participated in war bond tours, gave speeches, and became symbols of American courage. Many of them returned to combat duty. Jimmy Doolittle went on to become one of America's most important air commanders. He led the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and finally the 8th Air Force in Europe, where he commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. He retired as a lieutenant general and remained active in aviation and public service until his death in 1993 at age 96. Ted Lawson, who lost his leg in the crash off China, wrote a memoir called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that became a best-selling book and a hit movie in 1944, further cementing the raid's place in American popular culture. Many of the other raiders continued flying combat missions. Several were killed in action later in the war. Others survived and returned home to build careers in the military, aviation, and civilian life. The raiders formed a close brotherhood that lasted their entire lives. Beginning in 1946, they held annual reunions to commemorate the mission and honor their fallen comrades. These reunions became famous for a particular tradition. The raiders had commissioned a bottle of 1896 Hennessy Cognac, 1896 being Jimmy Doolittle's birth year, and engraved silver goblets with each raider's name. The tradition was that at each reunion, the surviving raiders would perform a private toast. Each living raider would turn his goblet right side up. The goblets of the deceased raiders remained inverted. When there were only 2 raiders left, they would open the bottle of cognac and drink a final toast to their fallen comrades. In 2013, the 4 surviving raiders, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Height, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Saylor, and Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, held what they announced would be their final toast. The bottle of cognac was opened, and the 4 veterans, all in their 90s, drank to the memory of their 76 fallen comrades. The goblets and the bottle are now on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where visitors can see them and remember the mission. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot and the last surviving member of the Doolittle Raid, passed away on April 9, 2019, at the age of 103. With his death, an entire generation of heroes passed into history. But their story lives on.
The Doolittle Raid has been commemorated in books, documentaries, movies, and monuments. Every year on April 18th, aviation enthusiasts and veterans gather to remember the mission. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet, now a museum ship in Alameda, California, hosts annual Doolittle Raid commemorations. B-25 Mitchell bombers still fly at air shows, often painted in the markings of the Raiders' aircraft. But beyond the commemorations and the history books, what does the Doolittle Raid teach us? First, it demonstrates the power of audacity. Military experts said launching Army bombers from a carrier was impossible. Doolittle proved them wrong. Sometimes the most effective strategy is the one nobody thinks you can execute. Second, it shows the importance of morale and psychological factors in warfare. The physical damage of the raid was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous, both in boosting American morale and shocking the Japanese into strategic mistakes. Third, it illustrates the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The raiders were volunteers, but they were also just regular Americans, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners who decided to do something that terrified them because their country needed it done. Let's dig even deeper into the strategic implications, because there's more to this story than just Midway. The Doolittle Raid fundamentally changed Japanese strategic thinking in several ways beyond just the decision to attack Midway. First, Japan was forced to recall hundreds of aircraft from frontline areas to defend the home islands. These aircraft and their pilots could have been used in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, or other contested areas where Japan was still on the offensive in mid-1942. Instead, they sat in Japan waiting for attacks that didn't come for years. Second, the raid demonstrated to Japanese planners that their early war conquests hadn't achieved true security. They had seized a vast perimeter of islands and territories, but that perimeter hadn't protected the home islands. This realization led to constant pressure to expand further, to seize more territory, to create an even larger defensive buffer. This overextension of Japanese forces contributed to their eventual defeat. Third, the raid created paranoia among Japanese leadership about additional attacks. Resources were diverted to air defense, civil defense, and dispersion of industry, resources that could have been used for offensive operations or reinforcing defensive positions elsewhere. Fourth, the execution of captured raiders and the massive retaliatory campaign in China damaged Japan's international reputation. Japan was already seen as brutal by many nations, but the extreme response to the Doolittle Raid provided additional evidence of Japanese war crimes and made it harder for Japan to negotiate or seek diplomatic solutions to the war. Fifth, the raid proved that American industry and innovation could respond to military challenges in unexpected ways. The Japanese had calculated American capabilities based on pre-war assessments. The Doolittle Raid showed that Americans could adapt, innovate, and execute operations that looked impossible on paper. This should have been a warning to Japan about America's ultimate potential, though Japanese leadership failed to fully appreciate it. The raid also had important implications for American military development. It demonstrated the potential of carrier-based air power to strike targets far beyond traditional ranges. This lesson influenced American naval aviation development throughout the war. The idea of using carriers as mobile air bases to strike targets at unprecedented distances became central to American strategy in the Pacific. Furthermore, the mission proved the value of joint Army and Navy operations. The Doolittle Raid required unprecedented cooperation between the Army Air Forces and the Navy. This cooperation, though not always smooth, set a precedent for future joint operations and helped break down some of the inter-service rivalries that had hampered American military effectiveness. The raid also validated strategic bombing concepts that were still controversial in 1942. While the physical damage was limited, the psychological and strategic effects demonstrated that air power could influence a war in ways beyond simply destroying enemy forces on the battlefield. This lesson would inform the massive strategic bombing campaigns in Europe and later in Japan. Fourth, it reminds us of the costs paid by others on our behalf. The Chinese people who helped the raiders paid an enormous price, hundreds of thousands killed in Japanese retribution. That sacrifice should never be forgotten. Finally, it demonstrates how small actions can have enormous consequences. 16 bombers, 80 men, a few minutes over Tokyo, but the ripples from those few minutes changed the course of the entire war.
Behind the strategic analysis and historical significance are human stories worth remembering. Let's talk about a few of the men who flew this mission. Jacob de Chazer, the bombardier who was captured, tortured, and imprisoned for 40 months, had a remarkable life after the war. While in prison, he was given a Bible to read for 3 weeks. The experience of reading that Bible transformed him. After the war, instead of harboring hatred for his captors, de Chazer became a Christian missionary and returned to Japan, where he spent 30 years working among the Japanese people. His story of forgiveness and reconciliation became famous in Japan, and he was honored by the Japanese government before his death in 2008. Even more remarkably, de Chazer's story influenced Mitsuo Fuchida, the Japanese pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fuchida read about de Chazer's forgiveness and eventually became a Christian evangelist himself, traveling the world speaking about peace and reconciliation. The bombardier who attacked Tokyo and the pilot who attacked Pearl Harbor both became evangelists, preaching forgiveness. It's an extraordinary coda to a story of war. Chase Nielsen, another captured raider who survived imprisonment, returned home and had to live with survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. He attended every reunion and became one of the most active members in keeping the raiders' memory alive. He worked to ensure that the executed raiders were never forgotten and that the brutality they suffered was documented for history. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, flew 28 more combat missions after the raid and survived the war. He went on to work in the Air Force and later the Air Force Reserve, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He was known for his humility, often deflecting attention from himself to the other raiders, particularly those who were captured or killed. In his final years, he became the keeper of the raiders' legacy, giving interviews and appearing at commemorations until shortly before his death in 103. Ted Lawson, who lost his leg, struggled with physical pain and psychological trauma for years after the war. But he channeled his experiences into writing 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which became one of the most important memoirs of the war. His book gave Americans an intimate look at what the raiders experienced and helped preserve the story for future generations. There are so many other stories. Pilots who went on to fly hundreds more combat missions, crew members who became prisoners of war in other theaters, men who struggled with what they had done and seen, men who carried their experiences silently for decades. One particularly poignant story involves the Chinese civilians who helped the raiders. Many of these people remain unknown: farmers, villagers, soldiers whose names were never recorded, but who risked and often lost everything to help American airmen they had never met and would never see again. Some historians have worked to identify and honor these Chinese heroes, but many will remain forever anonymous. The raid also affected Japanese civilians in ways that are often overlooked. While Japanese propaganda portrayed the raid as an atrocity, some Japanese civilians were shaken by the evidence that their leaders had not protected them as promised. The sight of American bombers over Tokyo planted seeds of doubt about the war that would grow over the following years as Japan's situation deteriorated.
In recent decades, historians have re-examined the Doolittle Raid with more critical eyes, and it's worth considering some of these reassessments. Some historians argued that the raid, while psychologically valuable, contributed to the prolongation of the war by hardening Japanese resolve and leading to the brutal treatment of both American prisoners and Chinese civilians. They point out that the raid gave Japanese militarists ammunition for their propaganda about American barbarism and may have made the Japanese population more willing to accept their government's call for total war. Others note that the strategic benefits, particularly regarding Midway, came with significant costs that are sometimes overlooked in popular narratives. The execution of 3 raiders, the death of Lieutenant Metter in captivity, the crash deaths, and the staggering Chinese casualties, possibly more than 250,000 deaths, all resulted from this one raid. There's also debate about whether the raid actually influenced the Japanese decision to attack Midway as much as popular accounts suggest. Some historians argue that Yamamoto was already planning the Midway operation and that the Doolittle Raid simply provided additional justification rather than being the primary cause. These critical reassessments are valuable and important. They remind us that war is complex, that actions have consequences beyond their immediate intentions, and that heroism and tragedy often exist together. But even considering these critiques, most historians still conclude that the Doolittle Raid was strategically valuable and that its benefits outweighed its costs. The boost to American morale came at a critical moment. The demonstration of American capability to strike back shocked the Japanese and influenced their strategic planning in ways that ultimately benefited the Allied cause. And the mission demonstrated American innovation, cooperation, and determination in ways that resonated throughout the war. The raid also must be understood in its historical context. In April 1942, the Allied powers were losing the war. The Axis powers were triumphant on every front. American military planners were desperate for any operation that could demonstrate American capability and will. The Doolittle Raid, for all its costs and limitations, achieved those objectives. Moreover, the raiders themselves went into the mission knowing full well that it was dangerous and that casualties were likely. They volunteered anyway. The Chinese people who helped them did so knowing the terrible risks they faced. These were conscious choices made by people who understood what was at stake. History is complicated. The Doolittle Raid was simultaneously a propaganda victory, a strategic success, a psychological shock to the enemy, a cause of terrible suffering, and an act of courage by people who chose to take enormous risks. All of these things can be true at once.
So let's bring this all together. The Doolittle Raid shocked the Japanese Empire into a realization that Americans were only beginning to fight. But it was more than that. It shocked them into strategic mistakes that would cost them the war. April 18, 1942 started as a day like any other in Tokyo. It ended with the Japanese military and government facing a terrifying realization. The home islands were not safe. The ocean barrier they had relied on was not insurmountable. The Americans, rather than being defeated and demoralized after Pearl Harbor, were coming back. And they were coming back with innovation, determination, and a willingness to take enormous risks. That realization led to panic, to strategic overreach, to the decision to extend the defensive perimeter by attacking Midway. And Midway led to the loss of 4 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots in a single day. From that point on, Japan was losing the war, though it would take 3 more years of brutal combat to reach the final conclusion. But the Doolittle Raid also represented something deeper about America and Americans. It represented the willingness to try the impossible when necessary. It represented the ability to innovate under pressure
It represented ordinary people stepping forward to do extraordinary things when their country needed them. 80 young men flew off a carrier deck, knowing they had no way to return. They flew into the heart of enemy territory with no support and minimal hope of survival. They bombed their targets and then flew into the unknown, trusting that somehow, some way, they would find a way home. Some did, some didn't. All of them became part of history. The physical damage they caused was minimal. A few buildings destroyed, some fires started, fewer than 100 Japanese killed. But the psychological impact was immeasurable. They proved that America could fight back. They forced Japan into strategic errors. They boosted American morale at the darkest moment of the war. They demonstrated that audacity and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The 16 B-25 bombers that took off from the USS Hornet that stormy morning changed the course of World War II. Not through firepower or destruction, but through the message they sent. America was not defeated. America was not giving up. America was just getting started. When Japanese leaders saw American bombers over Tokyo, they realized that Pearl Harbor hadn't ended the war, it had only begun it. And it was a war they would ultimately lose, in part because they reacted to the Doolittle Raid by making strategic mistakes that the Americans would exploit. The Doolittle Raiders didn't know they were changing history when they climbed into their aircraft that morning. They just knew they had a mission to complete and that their country was counting on them. That's often how history is made, not by people trying to be heroes, but by ordinary people doing their duty when duty calls. Today, we remember the Doolittle Raid not just as a military operation, but as a symbol of American resilience, innovation, and courage. We remember the 80 men who flew the mission, especially the 8 who were captured and the 4 who died in Japanese captivity. We remember the Chinese civilians who paid such a terrible price for helping American airmen. We remember the Japanese civilians who suffered from the bombings and from their own government's militarism. And we remember the lesson that audacity, courage, and determination can change the world. 16 bombers, 80 men, 1 carrier, 1 mission, and the course of the war was changed forever. The last surviving Doolittle Raider passed away in 2019, but their story lives on, reminding us of what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat, when they dare to attempt the impossible, and when they stand up for what they believe in, regardless of the cost. That's the real legacy of the Doolittle Raid, not the bombs that fell on Tokyo, but the message those bombs sent. America was not finished. The fight was just beginning, and in the end, America and its allies would prevail. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most remarkable stories. The Doolittle Raid is a reminder that warfare is as much about psychology and strategy as it is about firepower, and that sometimes the most impactful operations are the ones that everyone says are impossible. If you found this video educational and engaging, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more in-depth looks at history's most fascinating military operations and the people who carried them out. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the Doolittle Raid surprised you most? Do you think the raid's benefits justified its costs? How do you think history should remember the Chinese civilians who helped the raiders? Let me know below. I read every comment. If you want to learn more about the Doolittle Raid, I highly recommend Target Tokyo by James M. Scott, The First Heroes by Craig Nelson, and 30 Seconds Over Tokyo by Ted Lawson. These books provide incredible detail and personal stories from the raid. Until next time, remember the lessons of history, honor those who served, and never underestimate what determined people can accomplish when they refuse to give up.